The morning Cornelius Fletcher sold his daughter's hand to cover a gambling debt was the morning Jedediah Sheridan decided that some arrangements in this world were simply not worth honoring. The year was 1873, and the town of Dusthaven, Nevada sat baked and brittle beneath a sun that showed no mercy to anyone who dared walk its main street without a hat pulled low. It was a town that had grown up fast around a silver mine that had mostly run dry, leaving behind a population of stubborn people who had nowhere better to go and too much pride to admit it. There was a general store, a livery, a church with a leaning steeple, a doctor who also pulled teeth, and the Silver Spur Saloon, where fortunes and reputations had a habit of disappearing in the same night. Jedediah Sheridan had ridden into Dusthaven 3 weeks prior with a worn saddlebag, a chestnut mare named Clara, and a reputation that preceded him by about half a day. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that flanked the canyon east of town. He had spent 5 years working cattle drives up from Texas, saved every coin he did not spend on food, and arrived in Nevada with a modest sum and a plan to purchase a parcel of land he had heard about from a freighter in Salt Lake City. He was not a man given to gambling or drinking past a single glass of rye, and he had never once in his adult life taken anything that was not offered to him freely. He had been sitting at a corner table in the Silver Spur on the night in question, nursing that single glass and watching the card games with the mild interest of a man who had learned to read people the way other men read trail maps, when Cornelius Fletcher had made his proposition to Darnell Hogg. Darnell Hogg was 43 years old and owned the largest remaining cattle operation within 30 miles of Dusthaven. He was a thick man, not fat but solid in the way that suggested he had once done hard physical work and had since paid other men to do it for him. He wore his money loudly, in the silver buttons of his vest and the polished boots that never seemed to carry a speck of trail dust. He had been wanting the 40-acre parcel along Crescent Creek for 2 years, and Cornelius Fletcher had been unwilling to sell it. Until now. Cornelius was 51 and had the hollowed look of a man who had been losing fights with whiskey for a decade. His hands shook slightly when he held his cards. He had once been a decent farmer, people in town would say, but the farm had dwindled to the house and that creekside parcel, and even those had been mortgaged and remortgaged until the paperwork resembled a map of a place no one could find. He owed Hogg $460 from a string of card games over the past 3 months, a sum that might as well have been $4,000 given the state of his pockets. Jedediah had not been eavesdropping intentionally, but the saloon was not large, and the corner table was close enough to the round poker table that, when Cornelius Fletcher dropped his voice to what he believed was a quiet register, Jedediah heard every word. "I do not have the land," Cornelius said, his eyes moving from his cards to Hogg's face and back again with the restless panic of a cornered animal. "The bank holds the deed, but I have my daughter. Abigail is 22. She is healthy and able." "You have been without a wife 3 years now, Darnell. She keeps a good house. She can cook. She is a fair-looking woman. I will sign the agreement tonight." There was a pause at the table. 2 other men folded their cards slowly and looked away, the way men in that era did when they wanted to pretend they had not heard something that sat poorly with them. Hogg studied his cards for a long moment, then set them face down on the felt. "Your daughter," he repeated, "in exchange for the debt being cleared." "Every dollar." Hogg leaned back in his chair, and a slow, satisfied expression moved across his face. "I have been thinking she was a fine-looking woman," he said. "All right. Write it up." Jedediah set his glass down on the table with a soft click that nonetheless drew his own attention. He felt something harden in his chest. He had grown up watching his mother be spoken of as though she were furniture to be arranged, and the feeling that rose in him now was not outrage exactly. It was older and quieter and far more determined than outrage. He stood up, tucked his hat under his arm, walked to the bar, paid his tab, and left the saloon without saying a word to anyone. But he did not go to bed. He stood in the dark street for a long moment, the desert wind moving warm and dry through Dusthaven, the sound of the piano in the saloon drifting out through the batwing doors. He thought about the woman named Abigail Fletcher, whom he had seen exactly twice since arriving in town. Once at the general store, where she had been buying flour and cornmeal, and once at the church steps on a Sunday morning, where she had been speaking with the minister's wife about something that had made her laugh. Both times he had noticed her the way a man notices a thing that does not quite fit the rough framing of everything around it, not because she was out of place, but because she was simply and entirely herself. She was not a small woman, not frail or timid in the way some men seemed to prefer their women in those days. She was medium height with a sturdy, capable way of moving, and she had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up, but that always seemed to be in the process of escaping its pins. Her eyes were the color of creek water, a gray-green that shifted depending on the light, and she had a directness in her expression that suggested she had long since stopped pretending not to have opinions. She was not the kind of woman who would thank someone for arranging her life without her consent. Jedediah was certain of that. He walked back to the boarding house where he was renting a room, and he made a decision that felt in his bones like the only sensible one available. The next morning, Jedediah rode out to the Fletcher property before 8 o'clock. He had dressed cleanly and brushed Clara's coat until she gleamed, for no particular reason except that it seemed right to make some effort. The Fletcher place was a half-mile east of the main road, a modest frame house with a kitchen garden running along its south wall and a barn that leaned slightly, but had not yet given up on itself. A washing line hung between two posts near the porch, and sheets moved lazily in the morning air. He tied Clara to the fence post and knocked on the door. Abigail Fletcher answered it herself. She was wearing a work dress the color of sage, her hair was only partially pinned, and she was holding a dish towel which she used to wipe her hands before she looked at him directly. There was a smear of flour on her left cheekbone that she was entirely unaware of. Her gray-green eyes studied him with calm, frank curiosity. "Can I help you?" she said. "My name is Jedediah Sheridan," he said, holding his hat in both hands. "I have been in Dusthaven about 3 weeks. I know you do not know me, Miss Fletcher, and I apologize for coming without having been introduced properly. I need to speak to your father. Is he home?" Something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of something cautious. "He is in the barn," she said, "though I should warn you he is not in a state to conduct business before noon most days." "I am aware of his habits," Jedediah said gently. "I was at the Silver Spur last night." The caution in her expression sharpened into something colder. She understood the implication immediately. He could see her put it together, and he watched a muscle tighten in her jaw. "I see," she said. "I wanted to speak to him before he and Hogg formalize anything," Jedediah said. "And I wanted to tell you directly that I will not be party to whatever arrangement he is planning. I am not here to be another man laying claim to your future, Miss Fletcher. I intend to make that very clear to him." She stared at him. The dish towel was still in her hands. "You heard what he said last night." "I did. And you rode out here to tell him no on my behalf." "I rode out here because someone should," Jedediah said, "and because I do not think you knew." The look on her face in that moment was one he would remember for the rest of his life. It was not gratitude, not exactly, though gratitude was in it. It was something more complicated and more honest, the expression of a woman who had grown accustomed to not being seen and who was suddenly, unexpectedly, being looked at clearly. "I did not know," she said quietly. "I knew the debts were bad. I did not know he had gone that far." "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I will take you to the barn." Cornelius Fletcher was sitting on an overturned crate in the barn, running a brush over the back of an old mule in the slow, unfocused way of a man whose hands needed something to do while his mind was elsewhere. He looked up when they entered, and his eyes went first to his daughter, then to Jedediah, and a thin wash of guilt crossed his face that he covered quickly with irritation. "Who are you?" he asked. "Jedediah Sheridan. I was at the Silver Spur last night, Mr. Fletcher." The guilt returned, more stubborn this time. Cornelius set the brush down. "That is my business," he said. "Mine and Hogg's." "It is your daughter's life," Jedediah said, keeping his voice level and respectful. "I am asking you man to man not to sign that agreement." Cornelius looked at Abigail, and something in the set of her expression seemed to make the fight go out of him temporarily. He had the appearance of a man who knew he had done something he could not entirely defend. "I owe him $460, he said. "I have nothing left to give him." "I will pay the debt," Jedediah said. Both Cornelius and Abigail stared at him. "I have money saved," Jedediah continued. "I will pay Hogg what you owe, every dollar. I ask nothing in return, not her hand, not land, nothing. The debt is cleared, the arrangement with Hogg is finished, and Miss Fletcher is free to live as she chooses." The silence in the barn was filled only with the sound of the mule shifting its weight and a sparrow moving in the loft above them. "Why?" Cornelius said. There was genuine bewilderment in the word. "Because it is the right thing to do," Jedediah said simply. Abigail was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read. Her brow was furrowed slightly, as though she was working out a problem that did not quite add up. Cornelius rubbed his face with both hands. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who was too tired and too ashamed to argue against something decent. "All right," he said. Jedediah settled the debt with Darnell Hogg that same afternoon. Hogg was displeased, to put it mildly. He sat across the desk in his office, which occupied the back room of the land office he effectively controlled, and he stared at the $460 Jedediah laid on the desk with an expression that mixed surprise with something uglier. "You are paying Fletcher's debt," Hogg said. "Why?" "Because the debt exists," Jedediah said. "The arrangement he offered you in exchange is off the table. That was between me and Fletcher." "It involved a third party who was not consulted," Jedediah said. "I am correcting that." Hogg's eyes narrowed. He was a man who understood leverage better than almost anything else, and he could feel some version of it slipping away from him. He counted the money slowly, deliberately, and when he finished, he looked up at Jedediah with cold assessment in his gaze. "You have made yourself an enemy today," he said, not dramatically, but flatly, in the tone of a man stating a weather forecast. "I have made a great many enemies doing fewer things of consequence," Jedediah replied, picked up his hat from the chair beside him, and walked out. What happened next was not something Jedediah had planned or even consciously hoped for. He had not paid that debt with any expectation of reward or relationship. He had simply done what his conscience had required him to do, and he had intended to get on with the business of finding his land parcel and building his life. But Dusthaven was a small town, and a gesture of that nature did not go unnoticed or undiscussed. 3 days after the debt was settled, Abigail Fletcher appeared at the boarding house where Jedediah was staying and asked for him at the front desk. Mrs. Paulson, the boarding house proprietor, brought him down from his room with an expression of transparent curiosity that she did not bother to conceal. Abigail was waiting in the small parlor off the front hall. She had dressed carefully today, in a dark green dress that suited the color of her eyes, and she had managed to get her hair pinned in a way that would hold for at least a few hours. She was carrying a covered dish. "I made a pie," she said, when he appeared in the doorway. "Apple. I wanted to thank you, and I did not know another way to do it that would be appropriate." Jedediah looked at the pie, then at her. "You did not need to do that," he said. "I know I did not need to," she said, with a faint edge of precision in her voice that told him she said very few things out of obligation. "I wanted to." He invited her to sit, and Mrs. Paulson appeared with alarming speed from the direction of the kitchen, bearing 2 plates and a knife, which Jedediah suspected had been waiting in readiness on the other side of the parlor door. They ate pie at the small parlor table while the afternoon light came through the lace curtains, and they talked. He learned that she had grown up in Dusthaven, that her mother had died of fever when Abigail was 14, that she had essentially been running the household since then. She had taught herself to read better than most people in town, borrowed books from the minister's wife, and anyone else who would lend them, and she had a particular fondness for anything written by Charles Dickens, whom she had read about in a newspaper article that someone had brought through on the stage. She was direct in her conversation in a way that he found deeply refreshing, not rude, but unclouded by the kind of performed softness that women of that era were often expected to display. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had died when he was 16 and left him and his mother in a situation not entirely unlike her own, that he had spent years on cattle drives not because he loved the trail life particularly, but because it paid better than most things available to a young man without land or education, and he was determined to save enough to eventually stop moving, that he had a quiet love of the land itself, not farming exactly, but the way a piece of ground could be made into something that meant something if you worked it with care. They talked for 2 hours. When she left, she shook his hand at the door and thanked him again, and he stood on the boarding house steps watching her walk down the street with that capable, unhurried stride, and he thought that he had never in his life wanted so much to have a reason to see someone again. He found the reason the following week. He had purchased a section of land 2 miles north of town, along a creek tributary that had water enough for a modest cattle operation, and he needed timber for fence posts. He happened to mention this in the general store while buying supplies, and the storekeeper, Mr. Albee, mentioned that the Fletcher property had a stand of good pine on its north edge that old Cornelius had been meaning to clear for years. Jedediah rode out that afternoon, hat in hand again, and spoke to Cornelius about purchasing timber rights. Cornelius was marginally more coherent than he had been in the barn. He was sitting on the porch, and he looked at Jedediah with an expression that was complicated, comprised equally of residual shame about the night at the Silver Spur and a cautious, slightly confused gratitude about the debt. He agreed to the timber arrangement at a fair price without much argument. And while they were discussing it on the porch, Abigail came around the side of the house from the kitchen garden with a basket of green beans on her arm and a smudge of earth on her wrist, and when she saw Jedediah standing there, she smiled. It was not the polite smile of social performance. It was the reflexive, genuine smile of someone pleased to see a particular person specifically. That smile stayed with Jedediah for approximately 4 days. He began finding reasons to be near the Fletcher property. He was not dishonest about it. He did not invent pretexts he was embarrassed of. He came to work the timber, which was a genuine task that took several weeks of cutting and hauling, and he came honestly and did the work, and he and Abigail began to talk the way 2 people do when they are in proximity to each other regularly, and discover that the conversation always has somewhere new to go. He asked her permission to call on her properly. He asked this while they were both standing at the edge of the pine stand, him with sawdust on his shirt, and her with a water jug she had brought out because the June heat had become unsparing. He was nervous in a way he had not been nervous about anything since he could remember, because she was not someone who would accept a compliment she did not think was earned or agree to something she did not genuinely want. "You are asking to court me," she said, studying him with those gray-green eyes. "I am," he said, "not because of the debt, not even slightly because of the debt." She was quiet for a moment, turning the water jug slowly in her hands. "You cleared that debt 3 weeks ago and you have not mentioned it once since," she observed. "Because it is finished," he said. "It was a thing that needed doing and it is done. What I am asking now is entirely separate." "You are asking because you want to," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I am asking because I think you are the most interesting person I have come across in a very long time," he said, "and because I find that when I am not here I am thinking about when I will be here again, and it seemed honest to tell you that rather than pretend I am only coming for the timber." The corner of her mouth curved. "The timber is a very thin excuse by this point," she said. "You have enough fence posts to fence the entire territory." "I am aware," he admitted. She handed him the water jug. "All right, Jedediah Sheridan," she said, "you may court me. But I want you to understand that I am not a woman who will be managed or arranged or told what I think. And if you find that difficult, you should probably say so now." "I am counting on it," he said. She laughed then, properly, the way he had seen her laugh on the church steps that Sunday, full and unguarded and lit from the inside, and Jedediah thought he was in very serious trouble. The courting was genuine and unhurried, and for both of them, unlike anything either had experienced before. Jedediah was 28 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life moving across the landscape with other men and cattle, and his experience of women had been limited to conversations too brief or interactions too formal to amount to much. Abigail was 22 and had spent years managing a household and a father who needed managing, and the men of Dusthaven had always seemed to her either too afraid of her directness or too inclined to overlook it. With each other, they were simply themselves. He took her walking along the creek on Sunday afternoons, when the light was amber and the cottonwoods threw long, cool shade over the water. He learned that she could name every wildflower that grew along the banks, and that she had learned this from her mother, who had known them all, and that speaking of her mother still carried a particular weight for her that she did not try to hide. He told her about Missouri, about the house his father had built with his own hands, and the way it had been so difficult to leave it but impossible to stay. And she listened with the full quality of attention that was one of the rarest things he had ever encountered. They argued on 3 separate occasions during those weeks of courting, which seemed to him a testament to the authenticity of the connection. The first was about the question of whether Cornelius Fletcher was beyond helping, which was a debate that mattered more to Abigail than she initially let on. She believed her father could be reached, could be pulled back from the edge he was standing on, and Jedediah, who had a more pragmatic view of men who had been drinking as long as Cornelius had, said so carefully and honestly, which she did not appreciate. They sat in silence for 10 minutes beside the creek before she said, quietly, "You might be right. That does not make it easier to hear." "I know," he said. "I am sorry I said it so plainly." "No," she said after another moment. "Do not apologize for saying it plainly. I would rather you do that than spare me." The second argument was about Darnell Hogg, who had not taken the loss of his leverage gracefully. Hogg had begun making things difficult in small ways, the way powerful men in small towns could, raising the price he charged for use of his cattle chutes on the road to market, speaking coolly to anyone who did business with Jedediah, making the social atmosphere of Dusthaven mildly uncomfortable for anyone connected to either Fletcher or Sheridan. Jedediah wanted to confront Hogg directly and make his position clear. Abigail thought this would escalate things unnecessarily. "He is a man who respects power," Jedediah said. "If I do not meet him directly, he will keep pushing. He is a man who holds grudges and has a longer reach than you do right now," Abigail said. "You have been here 2 months. He has been here 12 years. You do not have to win every confrontation on his schedule. So I should ignore it." "I am saying you should choose your moment," she said with great precision. "There is a difference." He thought about that for a long while after. She was right. It was a different kind of thinking than he was accustomed to, more patient, more strategic, and he found himself adjusting his approach accordingly. The third argument was the one that came closest to mattering. It happened in late July, when the heat had reached the kind of sustained intensity that made tempers short and sleep difficult. He had been working the land with 2 hired hands from town, and the work was going well, but he was tired and Abigail had come out to bring dinner in a basket, and he had said, without meaning to phrase it as he did, "You do not need to do that." She put the basket down on the tailgate of the wagon with careful deliberateness. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I only meant," he started and then stopped because he could hear clearly what it had sounded like. "Not gratitude, management." "I brought dinner because I chose to," she said, with the particular quiet of a woman who has been told what she does or does not need to do one too many times in her life. "I am aware that I do not need to. That is rather the point." "You are right," he said immediately. "I phrased that badly. I am sorry, Abigail." The use of her given name, which he did not often use without permission, and which she had recently told him he was allowed, seemed to take some of the edge out of the moment. She studied his face, apparently satisfied that the apology was genuine, and she picked the basket back up and handed it to him. "There is cornbread and cold chicken," she said, "and a jar of apple butter. Eat something." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the hint of a smile at the edge of it made her narrow her eyes at him in a way that was not actually stern at all. August came, burning and blue-skied, and Jedediah's fence lines were going up, and his small herd of 12 cattle were grazing along the creek, and his house, which was modest but well-built, was nearing completion with the help of a carpenter named Simon Yeats who had come from back east with his family the previous spring. The house had 3 rooms and a good porch facing west, which Jedediah had planned carefully because the sunsets in that part of Nevada were the kind that made a man feel the weight of the world fall away from him, and he wanted to be able to watch them. He had not thought about a woman sitting beside him on that porch when he designed it, but he found himself thinking about it now. It was on an evening in late August that Darnell Hogg made his move. It was not dramatic violence. It was the law, or what passed for the law in a county where Hogg had sufficient relationship with the county sheriff to make requests that were accommodated with minimal scrutiny. Hogg produced a document, old and badly handled, claiming that a portion of the land along the creek tributary that Jedediah had purchased fell within the boundaries of an earlier deed issued to Hogg's cattle operation, a deed that predated the one Jedediah had bought, and that, if valid, would cut Jedediah's water access in half. The document arrived via Deputy Marshal Tate on a Wednesday morning, folded in an official envelope, and accompanied by a notice that the matter would be reviewed at the county seat in Carson City within 30 days. Jedediah read the document twice, then rode into town and found Abigail at the general store, where she was buying thread. He handed her the document without a word. She read it standing in the aisle between bolts of cloth and canned goods. Her expression did not change much while she read, which he had learned meant she was thinking rather than reacting. "This is the Hogg property claim," she said. "He registered it with the county 2 years ago," Jedediah said, "before I bought my land. But the deed I purchased was registered after his, so either the county made an error when they sold it to me, or this is a claim he has been holding in reserve." "Waiting," she said. "Waiting for a reason to use it," he agreed. She folded the document and handed it back to him. "You need a land attorney," she said. "There is one in Carson City, a man named Walter Greer. He handled the estate of Mrs. Parsons' husband 2 years ago when there was a dispute over the cattle grazing rights. He knows how to read the surveys." "How do you know about him?" Jedediah asked. "I paid attention when things happened in this town," she said simply. "You should go to Carson City. Get ahead of this before the 30 days run." He rode to Carson City the following week. The journey took 2 days each way, and Abigail packed him food for the road in a cloth bag that he carried in his saddlebag, and found himself opening at midday with something that felt remarkably like warmth. Walter Greer was a wiry man of 60 with reading glasses and an absolute contempt for imprecise documentation, which turned out to be useful because the Hogg document under scrutiny had a significant imprecision. The survey lines it cited used a boundary marker, a specific rock formation described in the deed's language, that, when Greer compared it against the original survey maps filed with the territorial office, placed the claimed land not along the creek but 300 yards east of it. Hogg's claim, properly read, did not overlap Jedediah's water access at all. The error, or deception, lay in the way it was written, using vague language that assumed the reader would not check the primary surveys. Jedediah returned to Dusthaven 8 days after he had left, carrying Walter Greer's written analysis and a letter from the Territorial Land Office confirming the correct boundaries. He went directly to the county sheriff's office, laid both documents on the desk, and the deputy marshal, looking significantly less comfortable than he had when delivering Hogg's notice, agreed that the matter appeared to be resolved in Jedediah's favor. Hogg did not come to Jedediah directly after that. He was the kind of man who did not make frontal approaches when indirect ones were available, but after the land claim failed, the small pressures he had been applying gradually eased, as though he had decided the effort was no longer worth the outcome. Jedediah suspected, and Abigail confirmed, that Hogg had concluded he had underestimated his opponent, and that men of Hogg's type tended to redirect their attention toward easier targets when they encountered genuine resistance. There was a community social in September, organized by the minister's wife to raise money for the repair of the church roof. It was held in the open space behind the general store on a Saturday evening, with lanterns strung between posts and a fiddle player named Combe Reedy who could play reels and waltzes with equal enthusiasm, and could drink either one without affecting the other. Jedediah asked Abigail if she would attend with him. He asked in person, on the Fletcher porch, on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was aware that this was a public declaration of a kind that small towns read carefully. "People will talk," she said, not as a concern but as an observation. "They have been talking since I rode out here the first morning," he said. "I find I do not mind it if you do not." She considered this from the porch step where she was sitting, her chin resting on her hand. "I do not mind it," she said. "I will meet you at the social." "I would prefer to call for you," he said, "properly." She looked at him for a moment, and the gray-green of her eyes had something in them that was very close to the expression she had worn the morning he had first come to the barn, that complicated and honest thing, but warmer now. "Settled." "All right," she said, "properly." He came to the Fletcher house at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening with his horse brushed and his boots clean, and a small cluster of the late summer wildflowers that grew along his creek, which he had wrapped in a piece of calico because he had no ribbon. He stood at the door and Cornelius Fletcher opened it, and for a moment the two men looked at each other. Cornelius had not improved substantially since January, but he had not declined further either, and there were occasional days where he was almost recognizably the man his neighbors described from 20 years ago. He looked at Jedediah and then down at the wildflowers and then back at Jedediah with an expression that was genuinely difficult to categorize. "You are taking my daughter to the social," Cornelius said. "I am, sir, with her agreement." Cornelius nodded slowly. "You are a decent man, Sheridan," he said in a tone that suggested this was not a compliment he handed out easily. "I know what I did was wrong. I knew it when I was doing it. A man knows." "Yes, sir," Jedediah said without judgment. "She deserves better than what I have been," Cornelius said. He was looking past Jedediah to the road, the way old men look at things they cannot reach. "Better than Hogg would have been, certainly. Better than what I have given her." "She is doing well," Jedediah said. "She is doing well because of herself, and nothing about that reflects poorly on you." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "She will be down directly," he said. Abigail came down in a dress that was neither new nor particularly fine, because it was 1873 in a small Nevada town, and fine dresses were not a regular feature of anyone's wardrobe who was not named Hogg. But she had pressed it carefully, and she had managed her hair with a dark green ribbon that matched the sage color of her everyday dress in a different key. She looked entirely like herself, which was the best thing Jedediah knew how to say about anyone. She saw the wildflowers and something crossed her face that she covered quickly but not quite quickly enough. "You went to the creek for those," she said. "This morning," he said. "The late summer ones. There is a variety growing on the south bank that I have not been able to identify. Yellow with the small center. Golden aster," she said immediately. "My mother called it prairie treasure." She was not entirely accurate in the botanical name, but it suited. He held them out to her. She took them with both hands and looked at them for a moment, then looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, simply and without decoration. They walked to the social together, and the distance from the Fletcher house to behind the general store was not very long, but it was enough that they had time to talk, and enough that by the time they arrived with the lanterns glowing orange in the early September evening, they were already laughing about something Combe Reedy had done at the previous year's social, which Abigail had witnessed and was describing with careful accuracy, and a perfectly controlled expression that gave way every few sentences to a smile she was not quite managing to suppress. The social was warm and loud in the way that small frontier community gatherings were, full of people who saw each other every day but who dressed up slightly on these occasions as a collective gesture of hope. The minister's wife circulated with a collection plate for the roof fund. Several children chased each other around the edges of the lamplight. The fiddle played. Jedediah danced twice with Abigail, which was the appropriate number for a couple who were courting, and who wanted it acknowledged but not made into theater. The first dance was a reel that required concentration and produced a great deal of laughter from both of them because Jedediah had learned reels in Missouri, and there appeared to be a regional variation in the footwork that led to them briefly colliding with another couple. The second dance was a slow waltz, and that one was different in quality entirely. He had his hand at her waist and her hand in his, and the lantern light was warm across her face, and she was looking up at him without the careful assessment she often wore, open and present and close. He could smell the faint cedar scent of the pressed dress and something that was simply her, warm and clean. "You dance reasonably well," she said, "despite the real incident." "The reel was a regional misunderstanding," he said. "The waltz is going well." "It is," she agreed, and there was something in the simplicity of it that made his chest feel full. After the dancing, they sat apart from the main noise for a while, on a bench at the edge of the lamplight, and they were quiet together with the easy comfort of two people who had passed the point of needing to fill silence. The night air was cooler now that September had arrived, the first suggestion that the killing heat of summer was preparing to ease its grip, and above them, the Nevada sky was so thick with stars that it looked almost false. "Jedediah," she said after a while. Yes, she was looking at the stars. "When you rode out to the Fletcher property that first morning with no prior acquaintance and no obligation, and told my father you would not allow the arrangement with Hogg and then went and paid the debt yourself," she paused. "I have been thinking about what that cost you." "It was money I had saved," he said. "I had the means." "I do not mean what it cost in dollars," she said. "I mean what it cost to choose to do that. To look at a situation that was not your problem, that most men would have walked away from, and decide that walking away was not acceptable." She finally looked at him. "I want you to know that I understand it was not a small thing, and I want you to know that I have never once in my life felt as though a stranger looked at me and saw me clearly." "You did." He looked at her for a long moment. The fiddle was playing something slow and sweet in the background, and the lamplight was making everything amber and soft. "Abigail," he said, "I need you to understand that I did not do that thing with any expectation. I am not holding it over anything. What is between us is entirely separate from that morning." "I know," she said. "That is the other part of why it matters." They sat together a while longer in the cooling September night, and when he walked her home later to the gate of the Fletcher property, he stood there with his hat in his hands and looked at her in the darkness and said, honestly and without performance, "I am falling in love with you. I thought you should know that." She was very still for a moment. The night wind moved through the cottonwood by the gate. "I know," she said again, but this time it was different, softer. "I think I am falling in love with you too." "That frightens me somewhat." "It frightens me considerably," he said with complete honesty. "Good," she said. "We are even." And she reached out and put her hand briefly against his jaw, just once, a touch that was so deliberate and so gentle that it said more than a great many words could have. Then she said good night and went inside. Jedediah walked home to his boarding house with the stars overhead and the cooling air around him, and the distinct impression that his life had arranged itself into something he had not planned, but that was nonetheless exactly right. October arrived, and with it the first real cold, the kind that came down from the mountains at night and made the mornings sharp and brilliant. Jedediah's house on the creek property was finished, a solid three-room structure with good walls and the west-facing porch he had planned. He had a wood stove in the main room and a cook stove in the kitchen, and a bedroom that still needed furniture beyond the rope bed and the trunk he had brought from the boarding house. He had been thinking about asking Abigail to marry him for approximately 3 weeks. He was not uncertain about the desire. He was uncertain about the timing and the approach, because she was not a woman who would be managed in this or any other respect, and he wanted to ask in a way that gave her full room to answer honestly in either direction without pressure. He chose a Sunday afternoon in late October when they had been walking along the creek, and the cottonwoods had gone gold and the water was running clear and cold over the stones. They had stopped at a wide flat rock above the bank that was a place they had come to think of as theirs, in the unspoken way that two people who walk the same ground repeatedly begin to assign meaning to particular spots. He had thought about speeches. He had discarded all of them. "Abigail," he said. "You are going to ask me something significant," she said, without turning from the water. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one where you are being very deliberate about everything because you are actually nervous," she said. "I have come to recognize it." "I am nervous," he confirmed. She turned then, and the gold light of the October afternoon was in her hair where it had escaped its pins, as it always did, and her gray-green eyes were steady and warm. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to ask you to be my wife, and I want to be clear that I am asking you, not anyone else, and that I am asking because you are the person I want to share my life with. My actual life, the mornings and the hard seasons and the good ones. I want to build something real with you. Not because of debts or arrangements or any obligation, because I love you and I believe we would make each other genuinely happy." She held his gaze for a long moment. The creek moved. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "Yes," she said, not quietly, not with hesitation, clearly and warmly and with the full directness that was so essentially herself. "Yes, Jedediah, I will marry you." He let out a breath he had apparently been holding for longer than he knew. She laughed at the sound of it, and he stepped forward and took her hands in both of his. And for a moment they simply stood there by the creek in the October light, her hands warm in his, both of them looking at each other with the full, astonished happiness of people who have unexpectedly found what they had not been certain existed. He kissed her then, carefully, and with the restrained tenderness of a man who understood that some things are best approached without haste. She kissed him back with equal care, and when they separated she was looking at him with a slight flush of color in her face and an expression of transparent, unguarded happiness that he had never seen from her before, and that struck him as perhaps the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. "We should tell your father," he said. "He will be surprised," she said. "I suspect he will be relieved," Jedediah said. "That too," she agreed. They married in November, in the Dusthaven church with the leaning steeple, which had just been repaired from the proceeds of the September social. It was a cold, clear day, the kind of winter day in Nevada where the sky is so intensely blue that it hurts to look at, and the light off the snow on the distant mountains makes everything look like it has been cleaned. The minister was a steady man named Reverend Carver, who had married a great many couples in that small church, and who conducted the ceremony with the kind of warm gravity that acknowledged the seriousness of the occasion without making it oppressive. The church was nearly full, because Dusthaven was the kind of town where a wedding meant something, and people came to witness it with genuine communal goodwill. Mrs. Paulson from the boarding house cried, which surprised no one. Simon Yeats, who had built the house, was there with his wife and their 3 children. Several of the ranchers and their families, who had become Jedediah's business acquaintances over the past months, sat in the wooden pews with their Sunday clothes on, and their hats held in their laps. Cornelius Fletcher walked Abigail down the aisle in a dark coat that he had pressed himself, and with his hands steady, because he had been abstaining from whiskey for 6 weeks by that point. 6 weeks that had not been easy and that Abigail had told Jedediah about quietly, with the complicated love of a daughter who had wanted something for her father for years and was watching it tentatively, carefully take form. Abigail wore her mother's dress, which she had taken in and altered over several evenings in October, working by lamplight at the kitchen table. It was ivory with small buttons up the back and a collar of lace that her mother had stitched herself. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers, because the November land offered nothing fresh, but she had pressed them herself from the late summer blooms, and they were exactly right. Jedediah stood at the altar and watched her come down that aisle and felt the full weight of the moment press against his chest in a way that was not unlike the feeling of standing at a high promontory and looking out at an enormous view, a sense of being simultaneously very small and very grateful to be alive. The vows they exchanged were the traditional words of the era, but when Jedediah said them, he put his full voice into them, not performing but meaning each word with the specificity that comes from having thought carefully about what you are committing to. Abigail said them with equal clarity and the direct, unhesitating certainty that was her nature. When Reverend Carver said the words that made them husband and wife, and Jedediah took her face in his hands and kissed her, the small congregation of Dusthaven offered the kind of applause that is more warmth than noise. They drove out to the house on the creek property together in the wagon, with the blue sky overhead and the cold air making the horse's breath come in small clouds, and when they came over the low rise and the house came into view with the late afternoon light on its west-facing windows and the creek catching silver beyond it, Abigail was quiet for a moment. "It is a good house," she said. "It needs more furniture," he said. "I have the bed and the trunk and the table. The rest I have been waiting for your opinion on because it seemed right that you should choose." She looked at him with that expression again, the one that was complicated and honest and warm. "You waited," she said. "It is your home," he said simply. She took his hand on the wagon seat and did not say anything for a moment, and when she spoke again it was about something else entirely, something practical and forward-looking, and it was perfect. They built the life they had described to each other. Not without difficulty, because the frontier West in 1873 was not a landscape that accommodated carelessness or passivity, and there were seasons that tested the cattle operation. A harsh winter in 1874 that killed 3 animals and required weeks of grueling work to keep the rest alive. A summer of thin rain that made the creek run low and the pasture brown. There were small illnesses and larger worries, and the ordinary friction of 2 people learning each other's depths and limits through the close daily contact of a shared life. But there was also the west-facing porch and the sunsets. There was the way Abigail laughed at dinner when he said something she had not expected. There was the garden she planted along the south wall of the house in the spring, with the same practical determination her mother had taught her. There was the way he came in from the fence line at the end of a long day and found her at the table with a book, and the way she looked up without ceremony and said something about whatever she was reading, and the way the house felt occupied and warm and like a place that had been chosen rather than merely settled in. In the spring of 1875, Abigail told him she was going to have a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, over coffee, in the same direct way she said most things. She watched his face carefully while she said it, as though she was not entirely certain what she would find there. What she found was a man who set down his coffee cup very deliberately and looked at her for a moment with an expression she could only describe later as wonder, which was not a word she had expected to use for Jedediah Sheridan, who was generally more steady than wonderstruck. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. "I am not entirely certain of the date." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her hands in his and said, "Abigail." Just her name, nothing else, but with enough in it to fill the room. "Are you happy?" she said, because she was certain of many things, but she liked certainty confirmed. "I am the happiest man I have knowledge of," he said. Which was the truest thing he had said in recent memory. The child arrived in late September of 1875. A boy, born on a Tuesday morning when the first light was coming across the creek, and the cottonwoods were beginning to turn gold again. He came into the world with a strong voice and dark hair, and an expression that suggested he had views about the situation, which did not surprise either of his parents in the least. They named him Eli Fletcher Sheridan, giving him his mother's family name as his middle name, because Jedediah thought it was right that the Fletcher name should continue in some form, and Abigail, who rarely cried and who was not crying now though her eyes were very bright, pressed her lips together and nodded, and said it was a good name. Cornelius Fletcher came to see his grandson 3 days after the birth, riding out on the old mule, and dismounting slowly at the fence post with the careful movements of a man who was no longer pretending to be younger than he was. He was sober and had been sober for most of the past year, with lapses that were less frequent and further between and that he acknowledged without excuse. He sat in the kitchen while Abigail held the baby, and he looked at the child for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "He has your mother's forehead." He said it to Abigail, and his voice was rough with something he was not going to cry about and did not try to name. "I thought that too," Abigail said softly. Cornelius looked at Jedediah across the kitchen. "You have done right by her," he said, "more than right." "She has done right by me," Jedediah said. "It has been mutual." Cornelius nodded once and looked back at the baby, and the kitchen was warm and quiet, and the creek could be heard moving outside, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as important but that every person present understands, in some wordless way, to be significant. The years that followed had the quality of a life well lived and actively chosen. Jedediah's cattle operation grew steadily, not to the size of hogs, which was not what he was aiming for, but to something solid and self-sustaining, 12 cattle becoming 35 by 1878, with 2 hired hands named Louis Morales and Tom Garrett who were reliable men, and who became a consistent presence on the property. Louis had come north from New Mexico and new horses, and cattle with the deep expertise of a man who had been around them his entire life. Tom was a young man of 23 from Ohio, who had come west seeking the romantic version of the frontier, and had found instead that the actual frontier involved a great deal of fence mending and early mornings, which he had adapted to with good humor. Jedediah paid them fairly, which was not universal practice on the frontier in those years, and treated them with the direct respect that characterized all his professional dealings. Abigail expanded the kitchen garden and began selling preserves and dried herbs through the general store, which became a modest but real additional income for the household. She was known in Dusthaven as a woman of considerable capability and even more considerable opinions, the latter of which were offered when asked and occasionally when not asked, but were always worth listening to, as even the people who disagreed with her tended to acknowledge. She began helping the minister's wife run a small informal school for the children of the town on Saturday mornings, teaching reading with the same patient directness she applied to everything. She read to Eli every evening before bed, whatever she was reading herself, modifying as needed. By the time he was 2.5, he was sitting with the particular alert attention of a child who understands that words are interesting before he understands all of what they mean. Jedediah observed this with a quiet, sustained delight. Watching Abigail with their son was one of the ongoing pleasures of his life. The way she talked to the child as though he was a full person whose intelligence should not be underestimated. The way she answered his increasingly complex questions with patience and accuracy, the way she read to him with expression and engaged in the stories herself. He told her this one evening when Eli was asleep and they were sitting on the west porch in the summer dark, with the stars out and the creek audible and the grasshoppers singing in the dry grass. "You are extraordinary with him," he said. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she got quiet when she was genuinely moved and not sure she wanted to show it. "I think about my mother," she said. "What she gave me before she went. The books, the flowers, the way she talked to me like my thoughts mattered." I want him to have that, to know that what he thinks and notices and wonders about is worth taking seriously. He knows it, Jedediah said. He will know it his whole life. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not do often and which he cherished without remark every time. The night air was warm and the stars were indecent in their abundance, and the creek moved below them with its steady, unhurried voice. I am happy, she said simply, as though she was still slightly surprised by it. So am I, he said. In the autumn of 1877, Darnell Hogg sold his cattle operation and left Dusthaven. There was some talk about the reasons: a combination of aging, a land dispute with his neighboring rancher on the east side that had gone against him in the territorial court, and what appeared to be a gradual loss of appetite for the management of a large operation without anyone to share the burden of it. He departed without ceremony on a Tuesday morning when the town was otherwise occupied, and the discussion of his going lasted about a week before Dusthaven's attention moved on to other things. Jedediah heard this news from Albie at the general store and said very little about it, which was his usual manner. But that evening when he told Abigail, she was quiet for a moment and then said, I find I have no particular feeling about it, which itself is a feeling. It means it is settled, Jedediah said, all of it. Yes, she agreed. I think that is right. And it was. The episode that had begun with a shameful night in the Silver Spur, and a man treating his daughter as currency, had resolved itself entirely and cleanly. And what remained was simply the life that had grown out of the decision to refuse that arrangement and do something better instead. The spring of 1879 brought a second child, a girl this time, born in April when the wildflowers were coming up along the creek bank in the yellow and white and soft purple that Abigail knew by every name they carried. They named her Clara Rose Sheridan, the first name for the mare who had carried Jedediah into Dusthaven 6 years before, and who was now old and comfortable in the paddock, and the middle name for Abigail's mother, whose full name had been Rose Abigail Fletcher, and whose memory was present in this house in many ways. Eli was 3.5 when his sister arrived, old enough to understand what was happening and young enough to approach it with the wholehearted and sometimes inconvenient enthusiasm of a small child encountering something large and new. He sat beside his mother the day after Clara was born and looked at the baby with furrowed concentration and then said, She is very small. She is, Abigail said. You were that small. He considered this information with visible skepticism. Was I, he said, in the flat tone of a child who is not convinced. Jedediah, who was leaning in the doorway and watching this exchange, laughed quietly, and Abigail looked up at him with the expression that was particular to them, warm and understood and private, the look that belongs only to two people who have lived enough life together that some things require no translation. Cornelius Fletcher lived to see both grandchildren. He died in the winter of 1880, in his bed, which was a dignified death for a man who had spent a portion of his life not treating himself with particular dignity. He had been sober for the better part of 2 years by then, and in those 2 years he had been, in the limited and late-arriving way available to him, a grandfather who came on Sundays and sat on the porch and let Eli show him rocks from the creek, and who held Clara with the careful hands of a man who understood he was handling something irreplaceable. He left Abigail the house and the land, clear of debt, because he had spent those 2 years doing the sober work of clearing what had accumulated. It was not a grand inheritance, but it was honest, and Jedediah and Abigail sold the property the following spring at a fair price, and used the proceeds to purchase the adjacent parcel north of their own creek land, expanding the operation in the way that Jedediah had been quietly planning, and that Abigail had been thinking through with him in their evening conversations on the porch. The death of her father left Abigail with a grief that was complicated by the long, complicated nature of loving someone who had failed her in specific and significant ways, and who had nevertheless been her father, and who had, at the end, been trying. She was not demonstrative in her grief, which surprised no one who knew her, but Jedediah knew the signs of it, and he gave her the particular thing she needed without being asked, which was his steady presence and his willingness to simply be there without attempting to resolve or redirect what she was feeling. One evening, about a month after Cornelius's death, she said, "He was not a good father for most of my life." "No," Jedediah agreed. "He did try at the end. He did." "I am glad he had those 2 years," she said, "for his sake and for mine and for the children's, that he had the chance to be something different even briefly." "It matters," Jedediah said. She nodded. Then she looked at him directly, with all the full quality of her attention. "The morning you rode out to that barn," she said, "I have thought about what my life would have looked like if you had not, if you had heard what my father said and done what most men would have done, which was nothing. I am not able to think about that," he said honestly. "I do not have the capacity to imagine a version of the last 6 years that does not include you." She reached across and took his hand on the porch railing. "Neither do I," she said, "not any more." They sat together in the winter evening, with the stars coming out over the Nevada hills and the sound of Eli and Clara already asleep inside, and the warmth of the house at their backs, and the life they had made together spread out in every direction around them, settled and real and fully, completely theirs. By the summer of 1881, the Sheridan Ranch had 38 head of cattle and a reputation in the county for well-managed land and fair dealing. Jedediah had built a second barn and a good smokehouse, and had fenced the lower pasture in a way that finally gave him the water management he had planned for since the beginning. Louis Morales had brought his wife and young son from New Mexico to settle on a small house plot on the eastern edge of the property that Jedediah had offered to them at a modest rent. And this arrangement had worked well for everyone, and had added a neighbor in the genuine sense of the word, someone who shared the daily work and the concern for the land. Tom Garrett had moved on the previous year, lured back east by a letter from a woman he had been corresponding with, which everyone on the ranch agreed was a thoroughly reasonable reason to go, and his replacement was a young man named James Rourke, who had been a cowhand on a drive through the territory, and who had decided that wandering suited him less than it once had. He was 24, and had the particular quality of someone who applied himself fully to whatever task was in front of him, which Jedediah valued more than almost anything else in a hired man. The town of Dusthaven itself had changed in the 8 years since Jedediah had ridden in on Clara. The mine was more fully played out now, and some families had left seeking opportunity elsewhere, but those who remained had the particular committed quality of people who have decided that this is their place, and they intend to make something lasting of it. A new schoolhouse had been built, proper and permanent, replacing the Saturday morning sessions in the minister's parlor, and Abigail had been asked and had agreed to teach reading and writing 3 mornings a week, which she did with the same directness and patience she applied to everything. She was 30 years old now, and she wore 30 with the ease of someone who had grown into themselves fully and had no interest in pretending otherwise. The gray-green eyes were as direct as they had ever been, and the dark auburn hair was still escaping its pins on a regular basis, and she was still the most interesting person Jedediah had encountered in his life, which was a thing he had said to her once and which had made her look at him for a long moment before she said, "I feel the same way about you, Jedediah, though it still surprises me a little." "Why does it surprise you?" he had asked. "Because I did not know it was possible," she said. "To know someone this well and for them to keep being interesting, I had assumed people ran out." "You have never run out," he said. "Neither have you," she said. "I find I depend on that." In the summer of 1881, Eli turned 6 and was old enough to start at the schoolhouse, which produced in him a very serious approach to his studies that somewhat mirrored his mother and a persistent interest in the horses and cattle that mirrored his father, creating a child who was frequently torn between reading about something and going outside to look at the actual version of it. His parents found this entirely charming. Clara, who was 2, was in the process of becoming the kind of child who has extremely clear ideas about what she wants and the vocal range to communicate them, which Jedediah pointed out one evening was a Fletcher family trait. Abigail had given him a look of sublime serenity and said she had absolutely no idea what he was referring to, and the look on his face had made her laugh so hard she had set down her coffee cup. On an August evening of that summer, when the heat had eased into something almost gentle, and the light was going gold over the western hills, and the two children were inside with their supper, and the porch was theirs alone, Jedediah turned to look at his wife. She was reading, as she usually was in these quiet evening moments, a novel she had borrowed from the new school library that had been assembled from donations. Her hair was loose, which it was when they were home alone in the evenings, and it fell over her shoulder in a dark auburn wave that he had never once tired of looking at. She had flour on her sleeve from the baking she had done that afternoon, which she was aware of and had not bothered to address. She felt him looking and glanced up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at you." She gave him a faintly amused look. "You have been looking at me for 8 years." "Yes," he said. "I intend to keep doing it." She shook her head slightly, the small smile at the edge of her mouth that she used when she was genuinely pleased but did not want to be obvious about it. She went back to her book. He watched the light on the hills for a while, and the creek below them, and the evening falling slowly over the Nevada landscape with its extravagant colors, the orange and rose and deep violet that he had planned this porch to face all those years ago. He thought about the night in the Silver Spur, and the arrangement that had been made over a card table by two men who had not thought to consult the person most affected. He thought about the morning he had ridden out to the Fletcher barn with no expectation of anything except doing the right thing. He thought about apple pie in a boarding house parlor and wildflowers by a creek, and the first time she had laughed at something he said, and the particular quality of her voice when she said yes to marrying him, full and clear, and without hesitation. He thought about what it meant to refuse an arrangement. Not loudly, not with speeches or proclamations, but simply by choosing a different path, one that required more effort and offered no guarantees, the path of starting from the beginning and building something honest. The stars were coming out now, one by one, as they did every clear Nevada evening in the vast and indifferent and somehow companionable sky. Abigail turned a page. Inside the house, Clara said something in her clear, carrying 2-year-old voice, and Eli's older, more measured tone answered her. The creek ran below them. Jedediah reached over and took Abigail's hand, and she let him, without looking up from her book, her fingers settling into his in the easy way of long practice and genuine preference. She turned another page. He watched the last of the light leave the hills. In the spring of 1882, Abigail told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same morning way at the same kitchen table over coffee. He set his cup down with the same deliberateness and looked at her with the same wonder because some things did not diminish with repetition. "October again," he said. "Perhaps November this time," she said. "I am not certain." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his. "Eli will be beside himself," he said. "Clara will attempt to run the entire situation," Abigail said. "She does come by it honestly," he said. "Stop that," she said, and the laugh in her voice was the warmest sound in the world. The third child, another boy, came in November of 1882, arriving in a snowstorm that kept the doctor busy on the road, and resulted in Jedediah delivering the child himself with the guidance of Mrs. Yeats, the carpenter's wife, who had attended 3 births of her own and knew what she was doing. The child arrived healthy and loud, and with a remarkable quantity of dark hair, and Jedediah held him in the lamplight of their bedroom, while the snow came down outside, and Abigail lay exhausted and observant in the bed, and the child looked up at him with the unfocused focus of the newly born. They named him Thomas Rose Sheridan, Thomas for the plain, sturdy dignity of it, and Rose again for Abigail's mother, because the name deserved to continue in more than one child, And because the wildflowers along the creek meant something that Jedediah had come to understand fully. Eli, who was 7 by then, and who had been waiting with the patient anxiety of a child who has been told a significant event is imminent, was brought in to see his new brother by Abigail the following morning, and he looked at the baby with the same furrowed concentration he had brought to the inspection of Clara 3 years before. Then he looked at his father and said, "Is he supposed to be that color?" "That is simply how they start," Jedediah said. "You were the same." "Was I?" Eli said, with the same flat skepticism Clara had not yet developed, but that appeared to be a trait the family specialized in. Clara, who was 3 and who had thoughts about the matter, announced that the baby was hers and that his name was Dog, which the adults addressed with the gentle firmness that Clara's proposals generally required. They built a second bedroom onto the house that spring, with Jedediah doing most of the work himself and Simon Yeats coming to help with the framing on weekends. Louis Morales brought his son, who was 12 now and strong, and the 4 of them worked through 3 consecutive weekends until the room was finished, with a window that faced the creek, and let in the morning light in exactly the way Abigail had specified, because she had looked at the proposed placement and said it was wrong and been entirely correct. The house grew, in its modest and practical way, to hold the life inside it. The porch remained west-facing and unchanged, because some things are right to leave as they are. The summers passed and the winters came and went. The children grew in the way children do on working land, with a combination of practical knowledge and the particular self-sufficiency that comes from being trusted with real responsibility early. Eli had his father's patience and his mother's precision. Clara had her mother's directness, and though it would take her some time to admit it, her father's quiet steadiness underneath. Thomas, who became Tom almost immediately and seemed to prefer it, had a warmth and easy sociability that was his own, distinct from either parent, the first element of himself that could not be traced to Fletcher or Sheridan, but was simply and entirely Thomas. The Dusthaven school continued, and Abigail continued to teach reading in it 3 mornings a week until 1884, when the school hired a proper schoolteacher from back east, a young woman named Frances Heath who was excellent at her work, and who became one of Abigail's closest friends in the way that 2 women who respect each other's intelligence tend to. They had dinner at each other's homes once a fortnight, and argued about books with the cheerful intensity of people for whom argument is a form of pleasure rather than conflict. Jedediah watched his wife's friendship with Frances with the quiet appreciation of a man who knows his wife is fully herself and is glad of it. He had never wanted to be her entire world. He wanted to be her home, which was a different thing, and one he understood he had managed to become. On a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1884, 11 years after he had ridden into Dusthaven on a chestnut mare with a modest sum of savings and a plan that had not included any of this, Jedediah Sheridan stood on his west-facing porch and looked at his land. The cattle were in the lower pasture, 38 animals on good grass. The creek ran below the house, clear and steady. The garden along the south wall was at its height, producing abundantly in the way of Abigail's gardens, which she tended with fierce attention. Eli was in the barn with Louis, learning something about horses. Clara and Thomas were at the creek below the house, visible from the porch, chasing something in the shallows with the focused determination of children who have found something interesting. The sound of their voices came up clearly in the warm air. Abigail came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She stood beside him and looked at the same view he was looking at. She had been doing this for 11 years now, standing beside him at things, and it never became ordinary. "You are thinking," she said. "I am remembering," he said. "Remembering what?" "The night at the Silver Spur," he said, "and the morning after." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, one of the children shouted something cheerful. The creek moved. The summer afternoon lay golden and permanent over the landscape. "You refused an arrangement," she said. "I refused an arrangement," he confirmed. She turned to look at him, and the gray-green eyes were clear and steady and warm with 11 years of accumulated knowing. "I have thought about what I would have said," she said, "if someone had told me that morning what was going to happen. That a stranger who overheard my father at a card game would ride out and change everything. I would not have believed it." "Would you believe it now?" he said. "I know it," she said. "That is better than believing." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him with the ease of long habit and genuine want, and they stood on the west-facing porch in the Nevada summer and watched the light go slowly over the hills and the children play below, and the cattle graze in the lower pasture, and the creek run, and the late flowers in the garden hold their gold. Eli came out of the barn and saw his parents on the porch and raised a hand in greeting. Clara looked up from the creek and called something about a frog. Thomas fell into the water and came up laughing. Abigail laughed too, the full, unguarded laugh that had first shown him what was underneath the capable and careful exterior, the laugh that was entirely hers, and that he had been hearing for 11 years, and that still landed in his chest the same way it always had. He tightened his arm around her, and she tilted her head up to look at him, and the afternoon light was in her face, the escaped pins and the creek-colored eyes, and the woman who had always known her own mind and had chosen him with that mind fully engaged, and the life they had built together was every direction from where they stood, real and complete and entirely theirs. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. Simple as that, full as anything. The sun went down in its extravagant Nevada way, burning orange and deep rose over the western hills, and the porch caught the last of it, as it was designed to do, and the family on the land in the small Nevada town in the year 1884 was whole and warm and at peace, and the life that had begun with a refusal was the finest and truest thing either of them had ever known.